Welcome to INFS 325 Public Relations. We continue with the communication discussion we started in earlier sessions, and in this session we will look at the barriers to communication. So we'll look at the different types of communication barriers, and then we'll also look at ways to overcome the communication barriers. There are several communication barriers, but we will look at two main communication barriers, especially in the library, archives, and museums environment. So we'll look at noise barrier. What do you mean by noise barrier? And then we'll look at the different interpersonal barriers. So noise barrier, it's the actual transmission of a message which can be impaired no matter which medium of communication is used. So noise is any external factor which interferes with effective communication. And noise may be caused in the process of the communication by either a distraction or by a blocking of the part of the message or by diluting the strength of the message. Noise is actually anything which affects the communication. And we can describe noise as poor timing. So a PR officer who is going to communicate with the publics does not choose the appropriate time to communicate. Of course, we are aware that there are times, good times to communicate, bad times to communicate. If you have a good message or a bad message, you should know what time to communicate. You will not communicate a bad message at the beginning of a working day, because that will demoralize, and that will demoralize a worker. So you choose appropriate time to communicate such a message. So poor timing is a barrier to communication. Another barrier to communication is inappropriate channel, and that can create noise in the communication process. So poor choice of channel of communication can also be a contributory factor to misunderstanding the message. When you talk of channels of communication, you talk of the media, all right? So that can be a noise to the communication process. Then improper or inadequate information. This can also be noise. If you do not give enough information for people to act on a particular activity or event, it creates noise because people will not do exactly what they are supposed to do. So let's look at interpersonal barriers. What are interpersonal barriers? There are several of them. These are personal factors which may cause interpretation or communication which is very different from what the sender was hoping to send to you. In interpersonal barriers in libraries and archives, you can have so many. Most of the time, because we do not communicate, these barriers are always there. Our attitudes. The attitudes are predispositions to think in a certain way about a certain topic. So a staff who is there already has an attitude. So whenever you come and say something, it can create a barrier, cause a barrier. And many people have different attitudes towards either problems or issues which come up in the library. So let's look at some interpersonal barriers. They can be personal, they can be cultural, they can be educational, or they can be familial. What do you mean by personal barriers? Either we have the physical and emotional, and maybe the person's size, person's age, the person's social status. All these can cause personal barriers. Cultural barriers, where we are coming from. Some people, where they are coming from, they may not do certain things. And so when we are talking to them and those things are being done, then it causes a barrier. Then I think I mentioned earlier on using your left hand. That is very, very important in our culture. We don't use a left hand when talking to people or when receiving things from people. That is a cultural barrier. And so if a white man comes and uses his left, you feel offended because in your culture, you have to use your right hand in giving out anything. Then education. Education, the level and quality of a person's educational background can cause a barrier because he or she may not understand many things that you are telling him or her. Then your roots, that is where you're coming from. That is your familiar roots. So you may acquire certain tastes or biases either coming from your parents or coming from your grandparents, and these can cause barriers in communication. Religion can cause also barriers. So your belief about God or the supernatural can cause a barrier in communication. Your social class, it can also cause a barrier. Your race and your status can cause barriers in communication. When people are not comfortable with you because you are the CEO or the chief executive officer, so they may not come and tell you many things happening. That barrier is just the status barrier. So as a PR officer, you should know how to overcome this barrier, status barrier, which is very, very important in any organization. There are other barriers. Your emotions can cause barriers. Some people always come in either hyper or very low. That means they are so demoralized, they come in and walk in demoralized to work, either because of problems at home or problems when they're coming to work. So their emotions can actually influence whatever communication is going on a particular day. So emotions can cause barriers. Then your values can also cause barriers. If you are sensitive to staff, to their mood, to their feelings, or to their attitudes, it can cause barriers in communication. Then unwillingness. Some staff are generally unwilling to communicate. So there is a permanent barrier created. So for such people, you always need to encourage them to make the best out of them or bring out the best out of them so that that barrier will not be there or will at least be minimized. There is also a barrier when you misunderstand people. If you're not able to listen to people intelligently and sympathetically, there is always this barrier. And also, when you are not able to integrate properly with people, there's always this barrier which is created. So there are a lot of interpersonal barriers that we need to pay attention to, because as we communicate with our employees and with our staff, we will need to be able to avoid these barriers so that we'll be able to carry out our public relations activities. Another barrier is lack of discussion. When people know that you never really like any discussion, you just want to tell them what to do and that is it, that is a barrier. Then when you keep staff informed, it is always a barrier, and you will not get them to cooperate with you. What thrives when you keep staff uninformed is gossip and rumor. So in conclusion, there are several barriers to communication. We looked at two, the noise barrier and interpersonal barrier. You need to be able to read and be careful and note all these interpersonal barriers as they are so common in our environment. And note that failure to communicate with staff creates a good condition for the grapevine to grow and to flourish. The grapevine will fill the vacuum, and so there's always rumor and gossip. And before long, you know that your organization is crumbling. The publics, our publics, need to be constantly addressed in order to avoid all these communication barriers. For our publics, they have a lot of channels. So reach our publics either through the written message, letters, emails, or even through our mass media. Talk to them on radio, talk to them. You can come on television, write stories, use the news media, print, to be able to communicate with them. That way, with constant communication, you are able to eradicate many of these communication barriers. And then you are able to communicate and project the image of the public relation officer as it is required for you by your organization. I hope you have really enjoyed this lesson, and thank you for listening.